Drink beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of this buyer's guide. This one concerns my middle market recommendations. Please see the details shown on screen for other parts in this guide series. Okay, let's get on with it. Let us now move on to the middle market and my recommendations. In this market segment there are a couple of options that I recommend, as you can see. Firstly, my Grainfather will always be close to my heart. I recognise that compared to the Brewzilla 35 and 65 litre systems, that it lacks useful things like body and top lid handles, and also it does not have the same value for money factor that it once had compared to other systems going back a few years ago now. But I must stress that my recommendation is based on Grainfather fixing some issues they have with software. More on this later. Ultimately, what this choice will come down to is what you are looking to brew batch size wise and what you want features wise too. Some cheap and simple modifications, as you can see on my Grainfather system shown here. The Grainfather can be brought up to speed in some areas compared to the newer releases in the form of Robobrew Brewzilla. Firstly, this will be the false bottom. As you can see, I've added one to mine, and this is used in tandem with the supplied filter. This irons out all of the issues associated with the very small filter supplied with the Grainfather by standard. You will also notice that I have added a stainless steel circlip to hold the end piece on the standard filter in place. I have also replaced all of the screw fittings on the Grainfather with cam locks. This makes the general use of the system much easier, and I have a video that covers this in detail. If you are new to this, then you may wonder why some people would do all this modifying and spend extra money for a Grainfather compared to buying something cheaper that ultimately does the same thing. Currently the Grainfather is quite unique in that it has a smart controller that is equipped with Bluetooth. This allows you to transfer recipes to the controller via an Apple or Android smart device, ultimately meaning that no controller pre-programming is required. Check my channel for more videos that cover this controller in more detail. I have to say though that since the Connect's release this has been far from a smooth ride. Firstly, the recipe creator has been inaccurate to varying degrees since it was released. This creator is web-based and has seen its fair share of revisions since the release in early 2017, but to date sadly it remains inaccurate for recipes, despite the rewrite of the smartphone apps and its web version just recently in the summer of 2019. You simply cannot rely on it for recipe calculations in terms of OG, FG, BU-GU ratio or colour at this point, which is very disappointing, especially for me as one individual who has tried to work with the company to correct this. Currently I'm using Brewfather instead for recipe calculations, and previously was still using the Grainfather for notifications via the Connect control box. It was still handy in this way. Just not as useful as it should have been by this time 2.5 years later after the release of the Grainfather Connect. I say was, because since the new app came out early this summer, this has all changed for myself and many others. Let me explain. This whole package was greatly changed in the early summer of 2019, but to great fury of the Grainfather community, as it presented many problems, which was compounded by the sad fact that users could not roll back to a working platform. Hate posts were churned out in great numbers all over the Grainfather Facebook groups and further afield. One of the Grainfather salespeople was even attacked personally, even though it should have been pretty obvious that the app was not in his department. Even as the weeks have turned past a month, this has still continued. Grainfather has ignored calls from the community and also myself to bring back the old app and class this new app as a beta, with appropriate warnings. This way at least users can have a choice around if they voluntarily help with testing, or if they simply want to use an app that actually works as intended. The worst thing here being that many are still facing potentially dangerous issues. If you are not someone who pays attention to Facebook groups, then you will be probably unaware of this also. It has to be said that Grainfather are not handling this in a way that would be expected, especially when health and safety is involved. At the current time, the company are working hard to iron out all these bugs, but sadly both Android and iOS users are both affected, and this really depends on the model of phone and the version of the operating system. Hopefully you are watching this sometime later and Grainfather will have fixed it by now. If this is not fixed by the time you are watching this, then consider it enough for me to withdraw my recommendation. It feels very sad for me to actually say this, but it simply has to be said. And now for something positive. Grainfather also sell an aftermarket pipework that make it ready and efficient for small batches as low as 10 litres. I personally find this perfect for test batches, but that will not be of interest to everyone of course. At this current point you can actually obtain this for the Robobrew Brewzilla systems, but it involves buying a second standard pipework and cutting it in half yourself. I hear that it works just fine from those that have tested it over a period of time. I have ordered it though, and it was very cheap compared to the Grainfather small batchwork pipework, I have to say. Once I have tested this I will give some feedback in a future video. The Grainfather is supplied complete with a good and polished counterflow chiller. I much prefer these to immersion chillers because they are simply faster and use less water. Better alternatives can be bought though, and can be used with the Grainfather or other systems. A better alternative will probably be only desired if you live in an area with warm or even hot groundwater. On the flip side of the middle market, and for the same price or less, you can also buy a Robobrew 65 litre system. The release date will be the late summer this year for Europe. This is already available in Australia and the USA. As you can see within the stats, this will brew between 20 to 55 litre batches with no additional pipework needed. It has a great deal more heating power and has heating insulation like its sister 35 litre system, boosting this heating power further. It also has those ultra low density heating elements, something that the older Grainfather system could really benefit from. I think it's also fair to say that this offers a great deal more volume flexibility compared to the Grainfather. I wish I could use it for smaller batches than 20 litre, but I guess for most people 20 to 55 litres is ideal. It also has to be said there is nothing needed modification wise here to bring it up to speed, except you may wish to buy either a Kegland counterflow chiller or something more deluxe from another manufacturer, if, like me, you prefer a counterflow chiller to an immersion chiller. Even after doing this you will have a great deal more value for money if you can live without that Bluetooth controller. Like I said in my separate video review of this system, do not think of this as just a system for large batches. This is super fast for batches in the 20 to 30 litre range, and at this price point it would not really matter if you only used it in this range. It could be that at present this will suit you, but in the future you have the flexibility already to produce more if you ever need it. In terms of quality comparison overall, Brewzilla and Grainfather are very comparable. All homebrew equipment begins its life in China of course, with many factories making systems for numerous brands from the same stainless steel stock and off-the-shelf components. The Robobrew systems certainly have a much more sturdy recirculation pipe, as you can clearly see here, as well as those much desired handles that are missing from the current Grainfather. So I guess it should be fairly obvious by now that this 65 litre Brewzilla offers greater value for money than the Grainfather in its 30 litre form. Having said this, it really depends on how much value you put on a counterflow chiller and a Bluetooth controller out of the box. The Grainfather Connect controller is also sold as a separate unit though, and there are other alternatives out there also from companies like Blickman. So if you are electronically minded, then in theory you could use any of these with any brewing system. This now marks the end of part 2 of this series. Please use the link here to reach part 3, which looks at the premium market.